The only way to survive this cold is to hug me, said the cowboy to the freezing Apache woman. The wind screamed across the frozen prairie like a living thing, whipping snow into the air so fiercely that the world seemed to disappear in white. The night was bitterly cold, the kind of cold that crept into a man's bones and refused to let go. Anyone caught outside in such a storm would be lucky to survive an hour. Yet through the blizzard rode a lone cowboy named Daniel, leaning forward in his saddle as his horse struggled through the deepening snow. His wide-brim hat was crusted with ice, and his thick coat was nearly white from the storm, but he kept pushing forward. He had seen storms like this before, and he knew stopping out here could be just as deadly as continuing. The prairie stretched endlessly around him, a frozen ocean of wind and snow. The faint outline of distant hills had vanished completely, swallowed by the blizzard. Daniel could barely see a few feet ahead of his horse. The animal snorted and tossed its head nervously, clearly uneasy about something in the storm. Daniel gently patted its neck, trying to calm it, but then he noticed it too, a dark shape lying near a twisted, leafless tree a short distance away. At first Daniel thought it was nothing more than a fallen branch or a pile of snow-covered debris. But then the shape moved. His heart skipped. Without hesitation he pulled the reins and slid down from the saddle, his boots sinking deep into the snow. Fighting against the brutal wind, he hurried toward the shape. As he came closer, he realized it was a person lying half-buried in the snow. It was a woman. Her long black hair was tangled and frozen with ice, spread across the snow like dark threads. She wore the traditional clothing of an Apache woman, beautifully woven but far too thin for such deadly cold. Snow had gathered across her shoulders and arms, and her lips were pale and trembling. Her breathing was shallow, almost too faint to see. Daniel knelt beside her quickly. "Hey, can you hear me?" he said, his voice barely louder than the roaring wind. The woman stirred weakly. Her eyelids fluttered open, revealing dark eyes filled with fear and confusion. For a moment she stared at him, trying to understand who he was. When she realized he was a cowboy, her expression hardened with distrust. She tried to push his hand away, though she barely had the strength. "Don't touch me," she whispered, her voice shaking from the cold. Daniel frowned, realizing she was dangerously close to freezing to death. He quickly removed his heavy coat and wrapped it around her shoulders, trying to shield her from the storm. "If you stay out here, you won't survive," he said firmly. The wind roared louder, whipping snow across their faces. The woman's body shook violently as another wave of cold passed through her. Daniel could feel how cold her skin was even through the layers of fabric. He glanced around the empty prairie and realized something terrifying. The nearest town was miles away, and there was no shelter in sight. If they stayed out here much longer, the storm would take both of them. The woman's breathing grew weaker as she struggled to stay conscious. Daniel clenched his jaw, thinking quickly. There was only one way to keep her warm enough to survive. He looked at her seriously and spoke the words that felt awkward but necessary. "The only way to survive this cold is to hug me." The Apache woman froze, staring at him through the swirling snow, unsure whether to trust the stranger standing over her. The Apache woman stared at Daniel through the swirling snow, her dark eyes filled with suspicion and confusion. The wind roared around them, shaking the bare branches of the lonely tree nearby as if the storm itself was trying to tear the world apart. For a long moment she didn't move. The thought of trusting a cowboy, someone she had been taught her whole life to fear, felt impossible. Her people had suffered too much at the hands of men like him. Daniel could see the struggle in her eyes. He slowly raised his hands to show he meant no harm. Snow clung to his beard and hat, and his breath came out in thick clouds in the freezing air. "Listen," he said calmly, trying to be heard over the wind. "This isn't about anything else. If your body temperature keeps dropping, you won't make it through this storm." The woman tried to push herself up, but her arms trembled violently and she collapsed back into the snow. Her teeth chattered uncontrollably now, and even speaking seemed difficult. Daniel's concern grew. He had seen men freeze before during harsh winters on the prairie. The body slowly shut down, the mind grew confused, and eventually the cold claimed them. He wasn't about to watch that happen to someone lying right in front of him. The woman's breathing became uneven as another powerful gust of wind swept across the prairie. Snow blew against them like needles. She closed her eyes tightly, trying to gather what little strength she had left. "Why, help me," she whispered weakly, her voice barely audible. Daniel looked out into the endless storm for a moment before answering. "Because no one deserves to die alone in the snow." His words hung in the freezing air between them. Something in his voice sounded honest, simple, without pride or cruelty. The woman slowly opened her eyes again and studied his face. There was no mockery in his expression, no sign of the hatred she had expected. Only concern. Her body shivered harder now, the cold digging deeper into her bones. Pride and fear battled inside her mind, but the storm was winning. She could feel her strength slipping away with every passing second. Finally, after a long hesitation, she slowly moved closer. Daniel carefully wrapped his arms around her, shielding her from the brutal wind as best as he could. At first she remained stiff, her muscles tense and guarded. Her body felt like ice against his chest, trembling so violently he could feel every shiver. He tightened the coat around her shoulders and pulled her closer to share his warmth. Minutes passed while the blizzard raged around them. Snow continued to fall heavily, covering the ground deeper and deeper. But little by little, the warmth from Daniel's body began to spread through her frozen limbs. Her breathing slowly steadied. The violent shaking in her arms softened slightly, though she was still terribly cold. For the first time since he found her, she didn't try to pull away. She kept her eyes closed for a moment, feeling the warmth returning to her body. Then quietly she spoke again. "My name is Apache." Daniel gave a small nod. "Daniel." Another gust of wind screamed across the prairie, louder than before. The storm was growing worse, not better. Apache suddenly stiffened again and opened her eyes, listening carefully. At first Daniel heard nothing except the storm. But then, faintly in the distance, another sound reached his ears. Hoofbeats. Someone else was riding through the blizzard. Daniel lifted his head slightly, trying to hear through the screaming wind. At first the storm swallowed every sound, but then it came again, faint, rhythmic, and unmistakable. Hoofbeats. Apache's body instantly tensed in his arms. The warmth that had slowly begun returning to her face vanished, replaced by fear. "You hear them too?" Daniel asked quietly. She nodded, her eyes fixed on the white darkness beyond the tree. The sound of horses grew louder, echoing through the blizzard as several riders pushed their way across the frozen prairie. Daniel stood slowly, helping Apache sit up while keeping his coat wrapped tightly around her shoulders. His instincts told him this was trouble. No one traveled with multiple riders in a storm like this unless they had a serious reason. Through the swirling snow, dark shapes finally appeared on a distant ridge. Riders. 5 of them. Their horses struggled through the deep snow, but they kept moving with determination. Long coats flapped violently in the wind, and rifles hung across their backs. Even from a distance, Daniel could tell they weren't friendly travelers looking for shelter. Apache grabbed Daniel's arm suddenly. "They're looking for me," she whispered urgently. Daniel frowned. "Why?" Her eyes darted toward the riders again. Fear and anger mixed in her expression. "They think I stole something." Before Daniel could ask more, one of the riders shouted loudly as they spotted movement near the tree. "There," the man yelled through the storm. "She's over there." The riders immediately pushed their horses faster. Daniel cursed under his breath. Running across open prairie in a blizzard was nearly impossible, especially with someone still half frozen. But standing still wasn't an option either. He helped Apache to her feet. Her legs trembled weakly, but she managed to stand. "You can ride?" he asked. She shook her head slightly. "Too weak." Daniel glanced back toward his horse tied nearby, but the riders were already getting closer. If he tried to mount now, they would easily catch them. Snow whipped across the ground as the 5 men approached, forming a loose circle several yards away. Their horses stomped nervously, breath steaming into the cold night. One of the men pulled his hat lower and stared at Apache with a cruel smile. "Well, look what we found," he said. Another rider laughed. "Storm almost did our job for us." Daniel stepped slightly in front of Apache, his hand resting near the revolver at his side. The leader studied him carefully. "This ain't your business, cowboy." Daniel didn't move. "What do you want with her?" he asked. The man shrugged casually. "She stole something that don't belong to her." Apache's voice came from behind Daniel, weak but firm. "That's a lie." The riders ignored her. "Step aside," the leader said, his tone turning colder. "We'll take the girl and ride out. You can pretend none of this happened." The wind howled louder, swirling snow between them like a white curtain. For a moment no one spoke. Daniel looked at the frightened woman standing behind him. She could barely stand, yet she still faced the riders with quiet defiance. He slowly drew his revolver. The riders immediately reached for their weapons. Daniel's voice remained calm but firm. "Not tonight." For a split second everything went silent except for the raging storm. Then the first gunshot exploded through the blizzard. The gunshot shattered the storm like a crack of thunder. Daniel fired first, his revolver flashing in the white darkness. The bullet struck the snow just in front of the lead rider's horse, forcing the animal to rear up wildly. The startled horse screamed and nearly threw its rider off, creating a moment of chaos among the group. "Move!" Daniel shouted. He grabbed Apache's hand and pulled her away from the tree as the bounty hunters struggled to control their horses. The deep snow made every step heavy, but adrenaline pushed them forward. Behind them angry voices rose through the storm. "Don't let them get away," one of the riders yelled. Another gunshot cracked through the air, the bullet whistling past and disappearing somewhere in the swirling snow. Daniel kept running, half pulling Apache as they pushed across the frozen prairie. Her legs were still weak from the cold, and several times she stumbled, but Daniel refused to slow down. The blizzard had grown even stronger now. Wind roared across the open land, throwing thick waves of snow that blurred everything into white shadows. The bounty hunters tried to follow, but even their horses struggled to see where they were going. For a moment Daniel glanced back. The riders were there, but farther away than before. The storm was becoming their greatest ally. "Keep going," Daniel said breathlessly. Ahead of them a dark line of rocks rose from the snow like jagged teeth. Daniel had passed this area once before months ago while driving cattle. If he remembered correctly, there were small caves hidden between the stones, places where animals sometimes sheltered from storms. They pushed toward the rocks with the last of their strength. Another gunshot echoed behind them, but the bullet hit nothing except drifting snow. The riders were losing sight of them in the blizzard. Daniel finally reached the rocky ridge and quickly searched along the uneven wall. Snow had gathered in thick drifts between the stones, but then he spotted a narrow opening partly hidden by shadow. "There," he said. He guided Apache inside the small cave. The moment they stepped in, the roaring wind became muffled. It wasn't completely warm, but it was enough to escape the deadly force of the storm. Apache collapsed against the stone wall, breathing heavily. Her face was still pale, but the violent shaking had begun to ease now that the wind was no longer cutting through her clothes. Daniel stepped to the cave entrance and carefully looked outside. All he could see was endless white snow and darkness. The bounty hunters had disappeared somewhere in the storm. For now, they were safe. He finally lowered his revolver and sat down near the entrance, catching his breath. Both of them were exhausted, their bodies shaking from cold and the rush of fear. After a few moments of silence, Apache looked at him. "You risked your life for me," she said quietly. Daniel shrugged slightly, though his voice carried a tired honesty. "Couldn't just hand you over to men like that." She studied him carefully, as if trying to understand the kind of man he really was. Outside the cave the storm continued to rage across the prairie, wind screaming over the frozen land. But inside the small shelter there was a fragile warmth growing between them. Apache pulled Daniel's coat tighter around herself and spoke again. "This storm, it brought you to me." Daniel looked toward the cave entrance where snow still fell heavily. "Or maybe," he said softly, "it brought both of us a second chance." Neither of them knew what would happen when the storm finally passed, or whether the bounty hunters would return once the sky cleared. But one thing was certain. This freezing night had tied their fates together in a way neither of them had expected.